Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Outstanding Authors at Google Talk. It is with extreme personal pride and pleasure that I introduce Dr. Bob Sutton to speak with us today. Now, together with Jeff Pfeffer at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, Dr. Sutton has revolutionized business thought. In a world that's oversaturated with buzzwords, with half-truths, and dangerous bits of misinformation, Dr. Sutton provides us with a way to cross the knowing-doing gap. He warns us against these dangerous half-truths, and he speaks out against assholes in the workplace. So he's done a big, outstanding contribution to corporate America. Now, Dr. Sutton, as you may know, is a Harvard Business School trained professor. He's currently a professor of organizational behavior in the Department of Management Science and Engineering at Stanford University. So he is an engineer at heart. And his MS&E 280 class is one that I took and that many other people took in the audience. And it was really one of the monumental sort of life-changing classes and inspirational classes I took while at the Stanford MS&E school. And he's also the source of my favorite quote from the entirety of grad school. That's especially important if you're trying to decide whether to go to the PhD or do research or actually work. Dr. Sutton says at the end of his final class, work is overrated. So you've got to keep that in mind throughout your working life. Now, Dr. Sutton was going to talk to us today about his latest book, which is entitled Good Boss, Bad Boss. It's a follow-up to the no asshole rule based on a lot of things that people wrote in and talked to him about after that first book was published. And he tells what's necessary to make a really successful boss, so something that's particularly relevant to our work here at Google. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming him to our Authors at Google Talk.
All right. Is this thing on? Thank you, Cliff. So it's always nice when your former students only say the good stuff, because Cliff knows a lot of bad stuff, and so do other people in the audience. So what I'm going to do is to talk, as Cliff said, about some of the main ideas in this book that just came out. It actually just came out Tuesday, and it's called Good Boss, Bad Boss. And following Cliff's comments, let me set up how I got interested in this book. So I guess about 3 years ago, I published a book called The No Asshole Rule. And I guess that was my fourth book, and I've written lots of different books, including this one. But the level and kind of response I got to that book still sort of blows me away. I still, even now, get stories from all sorts of people all over the world about either the fact that they have an asshole that they work with, that they're worried about being an asshole, and it just goes on. And if you know anything about the publishing world, it's a little bit like the movie business, which is that when you have a success and that book sold very well, they want you to do a sequel, okay? So, and in fact, maybe the highlight of this, well, the camera's on, but I don't care. My French publisher, she writes me this note, and this is in the introduction to Good Boss, Bad Boss. She says, "Dear Bob, when are we going to see the asshole shits again?" So initially, under pressure, I started thinking about writing a sequel, but as I got into it, I realized two things: that I was kind of sick of writing about assholes, just assholes, frankly. And the other thing I realized is that essentially, if you looked through the emails and the conversations and everything that I was having about it, really the central character in those emails was the boss. It was either, and I went through and fairly compulsively at one point counted my emails, and it was in about 80% of the emails, the central character was the boss. It was either a boss who wanted to be better, or it was an employee, very often, who had an asshole boss, or in some cases I'd have success stories. They moved from a bad one to a good one, or a good one to a bad one, things like that. But it was always a central character. And the other thing that came out in those stories, and also in thinking about the academic literature, is it wasn't just that people wanted somebody who was nice. They wanted somebody who was nice and who was competent, or civilized and competent. Because in fact, maybe one of the worst things in the world is a nice, incompetent boss, because you feel so bad when they're incompetent, and if you've got to fire them, it's actually really difficult because you feel so bad they're such a nice person. So that idea of nice and competent, in fact, the way that I define a good boss in the book, and this is a definition that you can see in like human tribes going way back, is essentially somebody who is skilled at both performance, competence, and also things like treating people with respect, the humanity part, the notion of compassion. So striking sort of a balance between the two. So that's how I define them. And just sort of as a footnote, sometimes people say, well, what about those bosses who are real jerks and are real inhuman and still make a lot of money? And my reaction to that is, that's great. It's fine if you want to say that person is a good boss, but in my value system, that person does not qualify as a good human being and they're still a loser. So I'm trying to, if you will, look for the sort of delicate balance between the two. And I realize that when you're leading people, that's a difficult thing to do. So that's kind of the setup for it. So here's the book, which is here, so you don't have to know anything about it. One thing I would say, and you certainly got this in Cliff's introduction, is for better or worse, I'm saddled with having been an academic and publishing in academic journals and being an editor and stuff. And so the main thing I do, and like if you did a time and motion study of what I do when I write a book, about 75% of the time I'm reading peer-reviewed articles. But I do realize that most human beings don't like to read peer-reviewed articles. They are incredibly dull and boring, and actually not very useful either, although they have implications for utility. So what I tried to do was to try to have evidence-based ideas, but to illustrate them with stories. And in fact, have you ever had Chip Heath here for this session? He wrote this great book, Made to Stick. So, pardon me? Oh, he's fabulous. He's also got he's always in the bestseller list. So the main finding from Chip's book, Made to Stick, is that statistics show that people don't remember statistics, they remember stories. So I'm going to tell you a lot of stories, and occasionally I will refer to the evidence that this is based upon. And that's why my editors only complain about the book because it has too many endnotes, but I can't help it. I was sort of ruined by being an academic. All right. So let's start out with a little mental provisioning, which gets to this evidence-based sort of perspective I take. So when I was putting together the ideas and the perspective in this book, in some ways I was led by this Jimmy Buffett quote, which I've been following for a long time, which is that some things are still a mystery to me and other things are much too clear. And so in the world of management, or whatever you want to call it, business, whatever, if you start looking at what I would at least describe from my biased perspective, the best peer-reviewed studies, there are certain things that I don't know the answer to. And I'll give you an example. And the more I read about it, the more confused I get. Well, two of them. One is there a first mover advantage? Whenever I read that literature, it looks to me like it's a random scatter plot. And clearly, I guess Google did pretty well not being a first mover. There were a few search engines around before you guys came around. And then another one is the performance evaluation worth doing? So if you looked across studies of performance evaluations, and suppose you were trying to get FDA approval for it as a compound or a treatment, you wouldn't do very well because it sort of looks like about half the time it makes things better and half the time it makes things worse, which looks a little bit to me like randomness. Although there are some organizations that do better with performance evaluations than others, but my argument is that there are many organizations that would be better off having no performance evaluations at all. And I don't know how to tell you to do a good performance evaluation. And maybe the most satisfying involvement I ever had with an organization is one of your former partners, but now kind of a competitor, which is Mozilla of Firefox fame. And so they have a very interesting CEO, John Lilly, and he really does have guts. And so he decided that these performance evaluations they were doing were so stupid that he was going to get rid of them. So Mozilla has no performance evaluations now. What they do is they have a system that's obviously a much smaller and simpler organization than you folks. There's about 12 levels, and everybody at the same level gets paid the exact same amount, and they get the same bonus amount. And the only time you go through something like a performance evaluation is when either you go up a level or you're bad. You're going unplanned and might be fired. Other than that, the emphasis is on sort of moment-to-moment feedback. So that's sort of a cool solution to the problem. But that's sort of a digression, but I love telling that story. But because, I mean, having a CEO who is head of HR did not like being told to get rid of the performance evaluation, by the way, because his argument was, how am I going to get a job somewhere else if we had no performance evaluations? Which I think was a little narrow-minded. He's no longer there, by the way. So anyway, the main idea and main focus of good boss, bad boss is on areas where at least I think from looking at the academic literature, at least it looks to me, not all my academic colleagues would probably agree that, that there's a clear picture. So the main point of the book in some ways goes contrary to something that you often hear about good bosses or good leaders. So maybe many of you have heard the expression that it's not all about you. Like that's something I always say to bosses, it's not all about you. Well, I actually think that's a useful half-truth, because if you looked at research on what happens to human beings, and in fact apes too, when you put them in positions of power, actually in many ways it does become all about you. It becomes all about you in a couple of ways. One way in which it becomes all about you is that the people or other creatures that you lead start paying an enormous amount of attention to you, much more than you often realize, at least based on the experiments and other studies we see. And then the other reason that it's all about you is that the lot in life for every leader, especially as they get more senior, but even leaders of small groups, is your lot in life is you are going to get more credit and more blame than you deserve for the performance of the people you lead. And it's one of those things that I guess at least 2 or 3 times in the last 5 or 6 years I've done fairly detailed review of the relationship, especially between CEO action and firm performance. And there's lots of little nuances, and it sort of does look like the smaller the organization and the younger it is, the more that the senior management has an impact. But it sort of looks like the real impact of CEO actions is maybe 10, maybe 15% of the variance in performance. But the amount of credit and blame that leaders get is usually around 50%. And this works even when you do little tiny experimental groups. So back to this notion of it's all about you, that when you're in a position of leadership, they're looking at you, especially the people you lead, more closely than you probably realize. And 2, you're going to get more credit, more blame from everybody than you probably deserve. So in some ways, it actually is all about you. And in particular, I'm not arguing that the best bosses are egomaniacs. What they are is actually quite the opposite. They're remarkably sensitive to the ways that the actions they take affect the people that they lead in particular. But this isn't easy because there's this asymmetry problem, and this is something that's established in all sorts of studies, that when people are in positions of power, the people beneath them pay much more attention to them than they pay to their subordinates. So to give you an example, one of my favorite stories, some of us will remember the dark days of late 2008, early 2009. Even in Silicon Valley, firms were laying off people. Everybody but John Lilly, I knew, was laying off. Even Google had layoffs. My wife's CEO of the Northern California Girl Scouts, even she had to lay off staff members. It was a pretty sad sort of time. So I wrote an article during this time on being a good boss in a bad economy that was in Harvard Business Review. So being the sort of, I guess, capitalist professor I am, I started giving talks about it for money. And one of the talks I gave was to a group of project managers. This is at Stanford. And after the talk, this guy comes up to me. He says, "Let me tell you the interesting shoes story." So here's what happened. What happened was that one of the executive assistants walked up to an executive vice president and said, "When are the layoffs coming?" Well, in fact, in this organization, they had planned layoffs, and it was very, very well hidden, just like the lawyers told them to do, it was kept secret. But the problem was that this executive was shocked, and he couldn't figure out how this woman figured out there was going to be layoffs. And what she said to him was, "Today is an interesting shoes day." And so this guy had to tell, sort of like when you play poker with someone, when he had bad news, he would look at his shoes. And so they figured out from that bit of sort of like leakage, if you've ever read some of Ekman's stuff, that there was some bad news coming, and very quickly it turned out to be layoffs. So the reason I like that story is it sort of really does illustrate this asymmetry that I call the toxic tandem, that essentially one of the effects of hierarchy is that the people or creatures at the top don't pay nearly as much attention to their underlings as vice versa. So that's one thing you've got to realize is when you're in position of authority, people are watching you perhaps more closely than you might realize. And just as a quick aside, this happens in apes too. There's sort of some cool studies of baboon troops. It turns out that the average member of the baboon troop looks up at the boss, the alpha male, every 20 or 30 seconds. So on one hand, so you've got these problems, and then also, to make things worse, and one reason I call this the toxic tandem, is there's a lot of evidence that when you put people in positions of power, a whole bunch of things happen to make them insensitive jerks. And this is one of the things, there's especially a researcher at Berkeley named Dr. Keltner and another one at Stanford who have been studying this problem for quite a while. Deborah Grunfeld's her name. And there's probably a couple hundred peer-reviewed studies that show essentially that when you give people power over others, they tend to focus more on their own needs and concerns. They focus little attention on the needs of others, and they act like the rules don't apply to them. And maybe this is politically incorrect to say this or something, but I think Mark Hurd's behavior, I think, applies in all three of those, the sort of things that got him fired. I really wonder how cognizant he was of the, so like if you keep taking a gorgeous woman out to dinner who doesn't have a very high level position and you're CEO of a company like that and you're married, I think people notice and talk about you. So this is sort of a classic sort of pattern. And to show you what for me is not probably the most rigorous study, but is certainly the most entertaining power poisoning study, this is the cookie study with which Keltner reports. And essentially what this is a study where you had 3 Berkeley students and they were brainstorming about a social problem, things like how you make the UC campus more green. 2 of them were brainstormer, 1 was the boss evaluating what happened. But the key intervention was about halfway through the conversation, the experimenter brought in a plate of 5 cookies. Now, we all know the social norm that you don't eat the last cookie, so the interesting question is, well, what happened to cookie number 4, okay? And so here's what happened. So this is a study of disinhibited eating, right? So those with more power, they did tend to take the 4th cookie. They tend to eat with their mouths open because they did the videotape. And then, being careful researchers, they left more crumbs because they had them sitting at different places. And so the intercorrelation among these 3 measures of disinhibited eating was 0.8, which is pretty darn good, actually. But if you go back to my sort of 3 things, 1, more focused on your own needs, less on the needs of others, and the rules don't apply to me, it's really quite interesting. The other thing I should do for both the men and the women in the audience is describe the gender effects. It turned out the men did get somewhat worse, but what really, when they were given power, but what really drove the study was the women who were actually pretty civilized when they were in the lower power positions, but they became as bad at pigs as the men when you gave them power. So the gain score for the women was much higher for disinhibited eating. But this is sort of a cute study, but the reason that I think it's important and the reason I bring it up as one of the core ideas in the book is this challenge when you're in a position of authority over others. And people always talk to me about a world without authority, but I've never been in an organization where there were not status and power differences. Maybe yours is the one that doesn't, but there are some of those people like Larry and Sergey who seem to have some power. And these characteristics are things that happen to just about everybody who is in power, and there's this challenge of the most effective bosses are in tune with what it feels like to work for them, but a whole bunch of countervailing forces make it difficult to actually experience that state. Okay, so that's the setup. What I'm going to do, and I want to make sure and leave at least 5 or 10 minutes for a question, is to talk about some of the hallmarks of in-tune bosses. And so let me start with the first one, and there's some really cool research around this done by Frank Flynn, who's at the Stanford Business School, and some researchers at Columbia, and it's on assertiveness. And what they've been doing is a series of surveys and experiments where they show that the best bosses sort of are in the middle, sort of at the median of things like being competitive, aggressive, passive, submissive, so they're moderately assertive. And also, and by the way, some of the research shows that being, if you will, perfectly assertive is more important, for example, than how charismatic you are or not. The amount of variance explained looks pretty good. And the point they make, which I really like, is one of the problems with being a perfectly assertive boss about not being too pushy or not being pushy enough is that people don't notice it because you're not a jerk or you're not ignoring them too much. So it's actually, so they've got this analogy, it's like a perfectly salted dish, you don't notice it, the amount of salt. And then the other thing that they emphasize is it's not like the best bosses are sort of medium all the time. They have that sort of ability to read people, again, to be in tune with people, to know when to push, to know when to back off. And I guess I gave this talk at Disney Studios on Tuesday a variation of it. And one of the people from Disney Studios raised her hand and said, how do I know when I'm perfectly assertive? What guidelines can you give me? And my reaction to that is that's one of those places that although I take an evidence-based approach to management and business, in the end, a little bit like medicine, it's a craft that you can use evidence to inform your decision, but in the end, that it takes a lot of experience to be able to do it well. So no matter how many books your surgeon has read about how to do the surgery, the more operations he or she has done, the less likely you are to die. This is something that's quite well established. So it is a craft that takes time to learn. One little sort of quote to sort of back this up, although I'm a San Francisco Giants fan, this is the famous Tommy Lasorda, one of the most entertaining coaches in baseball in a long time. He was manager of the Dodgers for about 20 years, still works for the Dodger organization. In fact, I think he's worked for the organization about 50 years. And he had this great quote the day he took over managing the Dodgers, which is, I believe managing is like holding a dove in your hand. If you hold it too tightly, you kill it, but if you hold it too loosely, you lose it. So it's this idea of pushing just hard enough all the time. And again, to be able to do that, I think it comes back to, one, being in tune with the people you lead, and two, knowing the work that you lead well enough to know when to push and when to back off. Probably one of the main times when bosses should probably back off is especially when they're leading creative work. There's a lot of evidence that when you evaluate and watch people too closely when they're doing creative work, it causes a bunch of problems because not only does interrupting them with questions slow them down a lot, when you start evaluating them more closely, they start becoming afraid to fail. So they sort of drift back to the tried and true. And one of sort of like my favorite bosses, or one of the favorite quotes I've heard about this, it's from Bill Coyne. He led R&D at 3M for a decade. After you plant a seed in the ground, you don't dig it up every week to see how it's doing. And the place where I heard Bill Coyne say this was it was at Motorola. This must have been about 2002 or so. He had just stepped down and we're doing a panel for a couple hundred people. And the great thing about former CEOs and senior executives is they sometimes become very honest. And he said this thing which just amazed me because 3M is, in fact, like you have like the 20% rule or the 15% rule is sort of modeled, isn't that, is it the 20% or 50? That's sort of modeled after 3M's 15% rule, and really one of the model, creative organizations, and this was like 2002, they were in like the top of their era. But he said even though he was running R&D at 3M, there was a problem with senior executives, which was that when you brought them stuff too soon, they would screw it up. And so he described, I couldn't believe he said this, he described how part of my job was to bring the top management team pretty shiny things that would excite them, that would distract them from the really important work. And this is like, and by the way, I heard almost the same story at HP during their heyday too, or I don't know what their heyday was, but during a period they were doing well. Okay, the second one is for my students who have been around. I've been talking about this forever, and this is the notion of wisdom. So Jeff Pfeffer and I, my co-author, and I have worked on this a lot. And the basic sort of challenge here is there's a lot of evidence that the most effective bosses and leaders instill confidence in their followers. But the problem with instilling confidence in your followers is that sometimes you turn arrogant and start believing your own bullshit a little bit too much. So the challenge of being a good boss is to be confident enough. So that's why this notion of dancing on the edge of overconfidence without turning pig-headed. Psychologists and philosophers call this sometimes the attitude of wisdom. So it's the courage to act on what you know in concert with the humility to doubt your assumptions and actions. It's a hard thing to learn. It's easy to say. A good example of it, and maybe my favorite quote from any former CEO, this is also sort of came out after he kind of stepped down. This was an interview that I went to. It was somewhere in Mountain View or something, that was at a Harvard Business School conference, and Andy Grove was interviewed, and there's like 3 dissertations in this quote. So the first one is a pretty good definition of the attitude of wisdom. I think it's very important for you to do 2 things. Act on your temporary conviction as if it was a real conviction, and you realize that you are wrong, correct course very quickly. So that's the confidence and the humility. And then he goes on to say, essentially, you don't have time to test everything in massive detail. You've got to sort of clean up, make decisions and clean them up later. And then he said something which kind of amazes me, and is one of those things that I've been thinking about for a long time. So you have to keep up your own spirits, even though you well understand that you don't know what you're doing. So this is like one of the most famous, CEOs, and essentially he's saying that to be an effective leader, you've got to act more confident in what you're doing than you actually feel in many cases. And on one hand, this bothers me because, it's potentially unethical. He's sort of telling you to exaggerate. On the other hand, there is this thing called the self-fulfilling prophecy. And it turns out that, on average, the most effective leaders probably do this. Exhibit 1 for our country, the United States, is probably George Washington. If you read David McCulloch's 1776, George had a little trouble. He didn't quite even know what he was doing when he first took the job. And he kind of got better as he went along, but he was on that white horse, and he had the great uniform. He was always clean. Most of his soldiers were filthy. And he always acted sort of confident, sort of front stage, no matter how screwed up things were. But he had that ability to learn from his mistakes and to listen to the people who were on, if you will, his senior team and his soldiers to improve as he went along. So I would make an argument that on average, although arrogance and not being able to adjust is bad, you probably want a leader who's a little bit more confident than is warranted, assuming they don't have the rigidity problem. Okay, so sort of moving along with wisdom, one of the key things for wisdom is to actually being able to listen. Here's a nice quote from John Wooden. I think the key quote here is, faking it is worse than not doing it at all. And one of my favorite examples that sort of gets to this, so this happened about 1.5 years ago. One of my colleagues at Stanford named Hagariva Rao, we were at an all-day meeting with a quite famous organization. I can't name them because if you looked at the NDA I signed with them, they would shoot me if I named them. Or at least I'd have to deal with lawyers. So we're in this all-day meeting, and what happened was there was one guy who was the most senior person in the room. He did all the talking. He talked and he talked and he talked, and I was sitting next to a more junior person, the junior person was actually my client, and she kept whispering in my ear the PowerPoint decks that he was spewing out. So it's like this, you think of like the worst meeting you've ever been to, was one of those sort of horrible meetings. So finally about 2 o'clock, he sits down next to me and he was quiet. And then he sort of looks at me and he says, it looks like I'm listening, but I'm not listening. I'm reloading. I'm trying to think of what I'm going to say next. And if you think about that, so literally, even when he was listening, he wasn't even listening. He was just thinking about spewing out more stuff. And one of the most destructive meetings I ever met, and by the way, it's not like people didn't notice him. There was emails flying around all over the place that this guy was all transmission and no reception. And this is a well-ran enough organization that it got back to other senior people, and he got slapped around a little bit for his behavior. So I will give them a little courage for not being a terrible organization. Another issue which gets in the way of the attitude of wisdom is when people create sort of a fear-based environment. We were talking about this a little bit before. When you create a situation where people are afraid to criticize you, you as a boss have all sorts of problems. Exhibit 1, if you've read any of the stuff by Michael Lewis on the meltdown, as usual, he's like the best author. There was a great Vanity Fair article where he talked about Joe Cassano. So, although of course it's oversimplistic to blame the meltdown on any one person, if you wanted to pick somebody, Joe Cassano would probably be your guy, if you believe Michael Lewis. He was head of the unit at AIG that lost $45 billion. Well, I guess that we're into them for about $200 billion, $180 billion in tax money now, so it isn't all his fault. But he was sort of infamous for his arrogance and insecurity. So the fear level was so high, if you were critical of the organization, all hell broke loose. And I love this, was the way you dealt with Joe was by starting everything by saying, "You're right, Joe." And in fact, if you're the kind of boss and people always say you're right, that's a pretty good sign that maybe you're doing something wrong. And also there's another effect which is more subtle, and now Google is big enough, you might want to think about this a little bit, and this is this thing called the mum effect. So there's a bunch of psychological experiments, so you start with the experiments that in general, even if you're like you've got the nicest boss in the world and you're the nicest person, when we break bad news to people, they like us less. And it's just got to do with the emotion of it. Like you associate this person with negative emotion, And I think that partly as a result of that, many of us learn to sort of sugarcoat the bad news a little bit. And if you start sort of going up the hierarchy and think about the effects of all that sugarcoating, some pretty bad things can happen. And one of my favorite examples is that some of us may be old enough to remember a guy named Richard Feynman, a Nobel Prize winning physicist. He was on the Rogers Commission, and the purpose of the Rogers Commission was to try to figure out the cause of the explosion of the Challenger space shuttle. And there's a side story. He actually sort of figured it out and did this dramatic demonstration in Congress where he put a piece of the sort of tubing from the rockets into a beaker of ice, and then he broke it in front of them and said, I think this is the cause of the problem, and it was. But one of the things he did when he was running around doing his unauthorized stuff was he asked this question, which is, what is the probability that the main shuttle engine would fail? And the engineers at the bottom of the hierarchy estimated 1 in 200, and the bosses at the top estimated 1 in 100,000. And I would like to see the numbers, and we don't have the numbers, but we have some hints of what happened with that BP oil deck that blew up. I bet you would get sort of similar numbers, because there's a lot of evidence that the top BP executives were saying that the likelihood of what happened was virtually impossible. And it did happen. And then the final thing about the attitude of wisdom is that if you want to create an environment where, if you will, people have the courage to act on their knowledge and the humility to sort of doubt it, one of the most important things is to create an environment where people feel safe to fight. So the idea is to fight as if you're right and listen as if you're wrong. One of my favorite quotes, and one that's a little more complicated than it seems, is that when two people in business always agree, one of them is unnecessary. It's cute, but it's actually, I would describe it as a useful half-truth, because there are many times when you don't want people fighting. You don't want people fighting when they're flying an airplane, when they're doing a routine surgical procedure on you. Sometimes it's time to fight, and sometimes it's time to stop fighting and bond together. Another example, one of my favorite sort of people I've ever interviewed is Brad Bird of Pixar. Actually, I gave a version of this talk yesterday at Pixar, and rather than saying, like I'm going to say to you, that he feeds constructive conflict, I said, does he feed constructive conflict? And there was actually, one of his producers was there and talked about how fun he was to work with because it was all fighting and all friendly all the time. And in fact, if you look at some of the extra material from the Incredibles DVD, you can see a lot of sort of constructive conflict that he was involved in. So anyhow, when we interviewed him, Huggy Rao and I interviewed him for the McKinsey Quarterly, he described how when he took over a movie some of you may have seen called The Iron Giant, which was critically reviewed very positively, but did not do great at the box office. So it was sort of like a messed up team, and he said, I came in the first day, and I gave him this fantastic speech about how we should be arguing with each other all the time, and how it was going to be safe to do it, and I like this line, everyone will get humiliated and encouraged together, and he said it was one of the best speeches I ever gave, because he's sort of that kind of guy. He will sort of be all exuberant, and he said, then they stared at me for 3 weeks. And I'd be like drawing on the board and asking for help, and he said, I realized that I was teaching a group of abused school children. It was just like literally an abused family. And he said, finally, after about 3 or 4 weeks, one of them raised their hand and said, Brad, I think you're wrong. And he said, I built on that little kernel, and within a couple of months, it was actually pretty much rocking and rolling, and we were arguing. But the reason I like that story is, so I, as a management professor, it's very easy to say, go have constructive conflict, but if you don't have the trust to do it, it's not something that's easily accomplished. And that's the thing about Brad, he was kind of self-deprecating and funny at the same time. 2 quick caveats. Don't fight in the very early stage of idea generation. If you're in a brainstorming session, arguing about the ideas, it's probably too early. And I've already implied this, whoops. When you're in the implementation phase, you should probably stop fighting because that's pretty destructive. And Andy Grove also has a pretty good bit of advice here, which is that you should especially work hard to implement ideas that you think are completely wrong. And the reason he gives is that way when it fails, there's no doubt that it was because of a bad implementation. And I think that's sort of like a cute thing. And in general, if you've ever been on a project with somebody who thinks that you're doing something that's a bad idea. Sometimes they accidentally undermine it or maybe on purpose undermine it constantly. But so I like the Andy Grove sort of argument there. All right, so the next one, how am I doing on time? I will probably skip at least one. In fact, let me skip this one because I want to make sure. So I'll give you the short version. So the basic idea here is another thing, and this comes from some work that my colleague Jeff Pfeffer and I did on turning knowledge into action. One of the problems that organizations have and bosses have when they have trouble with performance issues is when they unwittingly start rewarding smart talk rather than smart action. And so Jeff and I have been studying this for a long time. The example of the first management team I studied, to sort of abbreviate it, was when I was a brand new full professor and therefore had so much job security it was almost impossible to fire me. I started doing consulting finally. I actually didn't consult until I got too much job security. And the first team I worked with was the top management team of a Fortune 200 company. And I was amazed how they would constantly make decisions and not implement them. And one of those decisions, which they still have not implemented, was to put the name of their product on their product. So my colleague Jeff Pfeffer and I started realizing that there's some weird times in organizational life when you get rewarded, or people will say smart things and not actually do them. And to sort of skip ahead, how do you overcome it? It turns out that people who manage the work, who actually understand it, tend to be much more effective. So it's one thing I sort of like start thinking about some of the most successful tech organizations. While your founders, you can't argue that they don't understand the technology since they invented it. Bill Gates is a pretty weird guy, but you can't argue he doesn't understand the technology. Larry Ellison's even weirder, but he sure understands his company. And then Steve Jobs probably knows what's going on too. And when you sort of go down the list, it turns out that managing stuff that you understand, there tends to be less smart talk because the boss is harder to fool. Oh, and the Bill George story is when Bill George took over as CEO of Medtronic, and I interviewed him about this, he didn't know anything about medical device companies, and he did something that was a lot different, for example, than what Carly Farina did when she took over HP. He spent 75% of his time the first 9 months in hospitals, talking to surgeons, watching surgery, talking to procurement officers who are very important in the medical device industry to understand the work that he was managing. Another thing is whining. I won't go that in detail, but whining's pretty destructive when people turn all their energy to trying to say how everything sucks rather than to try to make it better. Simple language and simple action. At the same time we had all the crazy mortgage stuff going on with the banks, you had A.G. Lafley running Procter & Gamble, and his motto was, keep it Sesame Street simple. I keep it Sesame Street simple. And if anybody has ever met A.G. Lafley, he talks to you like you're a 7-year-old. It's kind of like Mr. Rogers. Remember, those were kids are Sesame Street? And that's sort of, and so at Procter & Gamble, it was things like the customer is boss or the customer is king, but then they'd make billion-dollar decisions on the basis of a very simple approach. And then to talk about, well, now he's your competitor, an interesting example of keeping it simple is to look at what happened when Jobs took over as then acting CEO of Apple in 1997. And this is actually just a partial list of the hardware they had. And so he would walk around and he would say, well, why would I buy a Performa 5400 rather than an 8600? And as the quote said, we couldn't even tell our friends which ones to buy. And one of the things that Jobs did was within 1 year, all of the hardware was gone that they had just the year before when he got there, and they went to a simple 2x2 laptop, desktop, home office. And they still have got a pretty simple product line, actually, if you look at how much stuff they sell. So that's an argument for what it takes to turn knowledge into action. So I sped through that fast enough. I think we're back on time. The last 2 points is something that I thought about a lot when I was working on this book, which is the notion that what the best bosses do, and if you kind of oversimplify this, is like, where should you spend your time? Eliminating the negative or accentuating the positive? And accentuating the positive is probably a lot more fun, but at least if you look at the evidence, as I understand the evidence, you probably should focus on eliminating the negative first. And so let me talk a little bit about this. So first off with superstars, the question that I like to ask when I look at organizations to figure out whether or not the boss is breeding the right people or the organization is good at turning knowledge into action is I ask, who are your superstars? Like, what would you define the standard superstar? And one thing that Jeff Pfeffer and I figured out after looking at compensation systems a lot is that although they'll vary wildly, so you might have something like the General Electric compensation system, where 80% of the goodies go to the top 20% pretty consistently, or I saw somebody in the back wearing an IDEO t-shirt. And so IDEO is a company, a design consultancy, innovation consultancy I work with a lot. IDEO has a nearly socialistic reward system, actually, by the standards of many organizations. But when you look across organizations that tend to be well managed, the way that they define superstars are people who not only, if you will, push their individual agenda ahead, they help others around them succeed. And to give you an example of this, one of my favorite examples, my colleague Jeff Pfeffer and co-author, he went to Suits University for Men's Warehouse. How many of you know what Men's Warehouse is? So, you know, it's like that guy, although I bet you not many people shop at Men's Warehouse at Google, because you don't need to dress like that. But Men's Warehouse, the idea of Men's Warehouse is, of course, to sell suits to men who don't want to be there in the first place. That's the basic model. And one of the things they do in their compensation and norm system is have a sort of a cool system where there's one salesperson who is getting the money at the moment, who's getting the incentive, but everybody in the store is expected to help sustain the team selling environment. And they're pretty serious about doing this. So as an example, in their Seattle store, they had one guy who kept stealing sales, so they fired him. And when they fired him, the interesting thing is that no individual salesperson reached the same level of performance, but the store sales went up 30% overall. So that's sort of like a good example of, if you will, getting rid of a rotten apple. And that sort of brings me to my next point, which is that there's a lot of evidence that bad is stronger than good. So in fact, this is an academic article that was published in the Psychological Review. That's the title. And the basic argument is that negative events, people and so on, pack such a big wallop compared to positive ones, it's unbelievable. And a great one is the research on personal relationships. It turns out that in marriage, dating relationships, other personal relationships, that when things slip below 5-to-1, so for every good interaction, for every bad interaction, there's less than 5 good interactions, the chance of divorce, breaking up gets very high. So I always remember this in dealing with my wife, which is that if I've been bad, I figure I've got to at least make up 5 times. And if you look at the research, 5 is kind of the minimum. You should probably really aim for 10. But the general point is that, if you will, bad is stronger than good. And some of the best research, and there's actually a This American Life episode on this you can listen to, was done and reviewed by a guy named Will Phelps. And he looked at the group dynamics literature and essentially showed that different sort of negative characters, so what I would call assholes, deadbeats, depressive people, they would pretty consistently bring down performance 30 or 40% if they had just one. And there's 2 basic mechanisms that the researchers talk about why this happens. The first one is that if you've got somebody who is really destructive in your group, you basically spend an inordinate amount of time dealing with the person. So you're distracted from performance. That may sound familiar to some of you. And then the second thing is that it's contagious. Bad behavior is contagious, so like you catch the evilness. So the argument here is that although, if you will, eliminating the negative is not as much fun as accentuating the positive, if you're a boss, you might want to deal with, if you will, the problems and the shit first, because that's where you can have the biggest impact. So let me take maybe 5 more minutes, so I'll go through my last points pretty quickly, and then we can have some time for discussion. So the final point is, if you look at a lot of different studies, especially more survey-oriented studies, and you ask what are the characteristics of a good boss, somebody that somebody's committed to, who they work hard for and is unlikely to quit and would want to work for again, things like that. One of the characteristics that comes back over and over again is this notion that my boss has my back. My boss will protect me. And so this notion is the best bosses protect their people from harm, all sorts of idiocy. I'm going to tell you a story I heard at Pixar just yesterday because it's better than any of mine. I'll go through whatever other ones I have. So I gave this example, and there was one guy afterwards who was talking to me. He told me he worked for Pixar 28 years. I didn't even realize it was that old. So I guess they have a club at Pixar of people who've been there for more than half their lives, and he was the first member of it. And he described how when Pixar was part of Lucas Entertainment, and some of you may know the story, it's a pretty good story, which was that Pixar, which was still trying to make animated movies but being forced to do other things as well, it was part of the Lucas empire, but then Lucas had a messy divorce, so Jobs bought it for a song, bought it for $10 million from George Lucas. But before this happened, there was a bunch of financial problems, and Ed Catmull, and then there's a guy named Alvy Ray Smith. And if you don't know who Alvy Ray Smith is, I'd look at your Silicon Valley history. Amazing guy at Xerox PARC who was the main person who invented the technology that made 3D animation possible, and eventually got fired by Xerox PARC. In fact, he was never hired officially. He was a piece of equipment that was rented. That's how they got him in through their accounting system. Anyhow, so there was an efficiency guy who wanted to cut costs at Pixar. So I heard this from this guy, and there's a couple of other folks who have been around a long time just yesterday, and they kept saying to, especially to Ed Catmull and to Alvy Ray Smith, where's the list of people we've got to lay off? And they say, oh, we'll give it to you tomorrow, we'll give it to you tomorrow. So finally, they gave up and they gave him the list, and there were two names on the list, Ed Catmull and Alvy Ray Smith. And in that story, which they tell over and over again at Pixar, that's a sign that those guys had their backs. And by the way, they didn't do any layoffs. And a little bit later, Jobs bought it for $10 million. But to me, that's like a better story than any one I can tell you. And so I'll just sort of like zip ahead. Some of the more minor ways that a good boss might do it might be by seeing visitors so you can get your work done, making meetings short. My colleague Jeff Pfeffer, who writes about power and politics, will tell you if you want to get ahead and push people around and being known as powerful, you might start meetings late, hold people a little bit later to show that you're so important that whatever they're doing next isn't so important. But if you actually cared about their efficiency, you might keep the meeting shorter and if you will, cancel them on time or end them on time when possible. And then the other thing, and I'll tell this one quickly because I think it's fun, is, and I guess that the Alvy Ray Smith, Ed Catmull story falls in this too. One of the things that good bosses do in any large bureaucracy, there ends up being some idiocy from on high. And part of your job as a boss is to protect your people from idiocy from on high. And my favorite example of this was this is so long ago, like 1986. I just moved back from California. I did my dissertation on organizational death in Michigan, the process by which organizations are unwound. And I read that a large bank was closing 125 branches, and I contacted them immediately because I thought I could do a quantitative study of the closing process. And I met these guys in San Francisco at the RAT Patrol, the retail action team. They were overseeing the process. And what they did was, to get to know me, they gave me 4 closings to study, 4 that went well in terms of business kept, and 4 that went badly. And I did these little case studies, and the pattern was amazing. In the bad closings, the story was all the same. They'd say, the secret to our success was that we ignored the procedures from the retail action team. And I remember still, I was in San Jose at a branch manager. He took out this big fat book that had been put together by the retail action team, and he said, the secret to my success was I ignored everything in this book. Then I went to the bad closings, and their story was like the opposite. They said the reason we had so much trouble and we're so frustrated was we tried to follow these procedures and it wasn't possible. And then, for those of you who are probably more experienced now than I was then, as you would predict, when I presented these findings to the retail action teams, I was shown the door so quickly it was unbelievable, and never heard from them again. So that's the point about having employees back. So let me make one more quick comment, and then hopefully we have a few minutes for questions and comments. This is a study that isn't particularly new, but I think is still one of the most important ones I know. If you're going to be a boss and be in tune with your people, maybe the most important single thing for you to think about and understand is, after the people you lead interact with you, do they have more or less energy? And where this little insight comes from, one of those incredibly simple studies, which actually started out at McKinsey. There's a guy named Rob Cross who was working there when he did it. Now he's done it in 50 or 60 different firms. And what he keeps finding over and over again is, although he looks at a bunch of different variables, and he uses social network analysis, one of the main things that predicts whether or not a manager in particular gets a positive performance evaluation, gets promoted, and in particular is surrounded with hardworking, high-performing, innovative people, is just the simple answer to that question. After you talk to this person, do you have more or less energy? And I think the important footnote here is this is not an argument for charisma. In fact, one of the things that Rob really emphasizes is it's not about being charismatic or even overly emotionally positive. It's more about having faith and trust from people than anything else. Okay, so I sort of made it on time with a little bit of rushing. So comments or questions now that we're sort of at 5 to 1? Reactions?
So what about employees that need to vent sometimes? So people just need to vent because there's really frustrating stuff, and they just want to get it out. But it has the potential of creating a negative environment if it's taken wrong. And is that something that, how does a good manager
So that's an interesting question. So in general, when there's constant bitching that ends up being negative that comes along, and this is about 15 years ago, I did an ethnography at IDEO, and I heard this great statement from this guy, because I was like, why are you bitching? He was actually bitching about my friend and the founder, David Kelly, and I said, why are you bitching about David? He's such a great guy. And he looks at me and goes, oh, it isn't real complaining, it's just recreational bitching. and I think that's a pretty useful concept, because there's a difference between just in a little sort of whining we all do in life versus the stuff where there's like real vindictiveness. The other thing that I would say that's also important beyond that little recreational bitching point is that your bosses and other people in the organization need to be tolerant when you're actually pointing out flaws. And there's a difference between sort of whining and not being constructive and saying, that's wrong, we need to fix it, or things are going to be screwed up. And people who do that are very important in organizations that don't treat such people with proper respect, have all sorts of problems. For example, when they're hospitals and they don't treat people who do that with the right respect, they kill more people. So it's an important ability, as long as it's not just destructive whining that spreads like poison. But I think there's a balance there. Yes, hi.
Hi. How can employees help their bosses or their managers develop good habits?
Oh, I love that. So, well, first of all, I like that question because it's not all of like the boss's responsibility. It's partly your responsibility, the people that you lead. How can they help them lead good habits? I guess the first thing that comes to mind if I'm like managing my boss is that I want to try to figure out where my boss is at emotionally. And I actually heard a great example of this. A friend of mine just took a job in another university, and he interviewed the dean. And he asked the dean, he said, I want to know all your personal quirks, and I want to know the things I can do to help you be more successful. And then the other thing that I guess that I would say, and I don't always do this right, is that I think it's important to figure out when and where to criticize your boss. So try to avoid embarrassing them in public. And hopefully have the kind of boss that you can take aside and sort of beat up a little bit in private. But I think that's a good topic. In fact, it's one of the things I may even do the book after next on, the question of sort of like how you help and manage your boss, because the boss can't do everything. They need help with what they're doing. So that's a great topic.
So are there any final questions? Cool. With that being said, thank you, Dr. Sutton, and
Thanks,
amazing
Phil.
speech.
Thank you, guys. You guys are great. Thank you. Thank you.